everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wisdom Chat. I'm your host, Phil Holdsworth of Aurum Gold, and my guest today is Chris Budd. Chris Budd is very much a name known in the finance circles in terms of financial planning, but also he's an author, has written a number of books. One we'll allude to, but one we're actually going to address today, which is the 4 cornerstones of financial well-being. So, Chris, thank you very much for joining me today on Wisdom Chat.
My pleasure. Thanks for asking me, Phil.
Great. In thinking about our conversation, one of the things that really struck me was the motivation behind writing the book. So just to give some basis for our listeners, just say a little bit about yourself, but also what sort of motivated you to go from the original book that you wrote, the Financial Wellbeing book, to writing the book today, which has taken actually a deeper dive into that area. Chris.
So, look, one of the lines I like to use is that I actually invented the phrase financial well-being. I just didn't know that 2 people had invented it before me. Because when I wrote the original Financial Wellbeing book back in 2015, that phrase was inspired by the work of a cancer centre just outside Bristol, where I live, called the Penny Bron Cancer Centre. And I came up with they were talking about well-being in lots of different contexts. And I thought, well, we should have applied to money, financial well-being. I Googled it, and there were only 2 results on that Google search. If you Google it now, there's about 320 million results on that Google search. So to say things have moved on a bit would be an understatement, you know. The first book, the Financial Wellbeing book, is really about helping people to create their own financial plan. But it's a financial plan that's based around being happier, not just wealthier, right? Mm-hmm. This book is actually just really about the relationship between money and happiness. So it's a much deeper look at why we're not very good at money, why we don't make very good financial decisions. And there are good reasons why it's not our fault, but I think is a really important thing to note. And what you can do about it. So the 2 kind of just fit together beautifully. They're understanding more about the reasons why we're not very good with money will help you to then go back and create that financial plan around being happier, not just wealthier.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Chris. And I know as well, we're all individuals, we're all unique and all have our sort of different mindsets and approaches and so on. But to actually understand yourself, and I know you speak about happiness an awful lot, but to understand ourselves puts us in a better position to actually make the choices where we can pursue happiness in the sense that it is to us. But there's a statement that you make quite early on in your book. You say this: our relationship with money has shifted from a transactional one to accumulation focused one, where the focus is on accumulating more wealth rather than having enough. It's interesting that, because I suppose we could all say in society today there is a sense of a pursuit of wealth and a pursuit of materialism, as though these things are going to be the panacea to all our problems. What was your thoughts when you wrote that statement?
Well, look, as you say, what's a word that would best summarize our modern world? There's a few I can think of, but one of them is more. We always want more. Yeah. If you look at our definitions of success that we see around us, whether that be people showing off on social media or whether it's the celebrities that we follow, what have you, it's wealth. We see success in terms of money. I never have. I've never been impressed by money. In fact, a lot of the people I know who have worked hard, made a lot of money, they're not always very nice people. You know, some of them are. You know, crikey. You know, and in fact, that's an important thing to say, because it's not. These are easy cliches to fall into. You know, somebody might say, "Oh, that guy did me over on a deal, and he's really rich," and somebody will say, "Yeah, well, that's why he's really rich." No, that doesn't work. I know lots of people who are really lovely and wealthy. So we're all individuals. We're all unique. But I also Well, you said that just triggered a little memory of mine. One of my top 5 favorite films of all time has always been Life of Brian. And there's that moment when Brian's mum is addressing the masses, and sorry, Brian's addressing the masses, and he says, "You're all unique." He says, "Yes, we're all unique. You're all individuals." And then one person says, "I'm not." And I've always thought that's just the best joke ever. Well, that I think is actually really relevant here,
Yeah,
because there's what's true of everyone, right?
yeah,
If you get a hug from somebody who loves you, you'll feel better. That will be the same for everybody in the world, right?
yeah,
If you do something which is meaningful and purposeful, that will bring you joy. That's true of everybody in the world.
yeah,
But for you, that might mean, I don't know what it might mean. It might be going sailing with some friends. For me, it might be coaching kids at cricket. We each have our own thing that brings us. So there's the, what I call know thyself, understand what works for you, but also understand the truths that are true of everybody. And
yeah.
one of those truths is that more money doesn't automatically mean more well-being.
No,
There
no.
comes a point where the increments get smaller and smaller, and for many people there will be no more well-being, and that amount of money is maybe not as high as a lot of people will think.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that, Chris, because there's a question I often ask people. I say to them, in a word, what does money mean to you? And they'll naturally, there's a whole raft of things they can come up with, but they'll naturally come up with things like happiness, freedom, choice, security, and these are very sort of common statements they'll come up with. So I'll say, oh, right, that's interesting. So how much money would you need to feel happiness, to feel secure, to have choice and freedom? And you can see the cogs working then, because
Yeah,
then
yeah,
thinking,
yeah,
nobody's ever asked me that question.
yeah,
And and then I said to him, whatever figure you come up with, double it, treble it, quadruple it, because in many respects, you're looking for money to give you something it itself can't give you. And so therefore it will never be enough. But and I thought that really tied well in what you were saying
yeah,
about this,
yeah.
sort
I
of
would
going,
give a little. I would give
yeah,
a little follow on from that, if I may, Phil, because
yeah,
and I know you're having a conversation. You know that this is you're having a conversation with people about their money, but a popular question to a lot of people, a lot of financial advisors that I've heard over the last few years, is a question
mm,
such as, "What does money mean to you? What's your relationship with money?" and so on. And actually, for financial advisors, I always try and say, do you know what? The trouble with that question is you're framing the conversation to be about money.
yeah,
Your conversation is now going to be centered around money.
yeah,
So maybe we could ask a even more open question, just like what will make you happy? What
yes,
brings joy in your life?
yeah, yeah,
Um, I uh, I was a financial planner for 20 years, and a lot of people that I would work with, a question I wish I'd asked them is, "What is your money for?" Now, again, that could center the conversation around money, so there's a danger with that there. But what is your money for? What is the purpose of this money?
yeah,
And I work a lot with business owners and succession planning and what have you, selling to employee ownership trusts is what I did with my business. And that's one of the questions I asked them. And there's one person I was working with a few years ago who had a lot, a
yeah,
lot of money in his current account because he'd recently sold his business. And he was, in his own words, bereft. He had millions of pounds in his current account, but he
mm,
felt bereft because nobody had ever talked to him about what the money was for. He'd
yeah,
just been so busy accumulating, building his business, etc., etc. He'd never thought to look beyond the sale of his business. And so when he got there was nothing because he hadn't
yeah,
thought about it. So understanding the
yeah,
purpose of money to you, I think, is
yes.
is a step on maybe, or an alternative way of asking that question.
I really appreciate you saying that, Chris, because one of the things you look at what you feel people it would be good for people to be aware of for themselves. That self-awareness. One of which is what are your values? What's important to you? And we'll come to this a little bit later because you touch on purpose as well,
Yeah.
and I talk about that, but the rebuff I get often from people is, what's this got to do with money? What's this got to do with managing my finances? and I say it's got everything to do, because it influences everything about the choices that you make about your money. And I think the story that you've just recounted there, a good example of somebody not actually thinking about, well, yeah, what is it for?
Yeah.
Um,
I have a
thought,
bit of a, honest, in a simple way, I have a bit of a beef with the concept of financial goals, right?
right.
If you get a lot of banking apps or fintech apps, financial technology apps that are helping you to manage money, they almost always want you to say, what are your financial goals?
Yeah.
And in my example, this guy's financial goal would have been financial freedom, financial security.
Yeah.
That's what he said he'd always been working for. I'm looking for financial independence, would be another word. But that's not answering the right question. You're answering the wrong question. The
Yeah.
question is, when you get financial freedom, then what happens? Then what
Yes.
will you do?
Yeah.
And actually, could you do that now?
Yeah.
Do you need financial freedom to go and coach kids at cricket? You know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
It's a good point, because I talk about life goals, because I actually say to people, we're not covering financial goals, we're covering life goals, because whatever it is that you want your life to be, or to become, or to be like, has a monetary element attached to it, but we need to know what it is first before we can identify that monetary element. So that's a really good point. There's another statement I wanted to touch on, if I may, and it says money is an engine. I think this is brilliant, the way that you worded it. Money is an engine for well-being, but it can also be an engine for misery.
oh, did I write
that? I mean, I thought, wow, that is a really good way of being very succinct about something that's quite powerful.
Yeah. So look, how can money be an engine for misery? Let's go back to this word more. We need to understand a little bit of the psychology of happiness here. Okay, so I want to touch on intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. So let's start with extrinsic. An extrinsic motivation is something you do for other people. So it might be a target you've been given. It could be status to impress somebody. It could build a monetary objective that somebody else is going to give you a bonus at the end. All sorts of things that somebody else is determining. That's an extrinsic motivation.
Yeah.
An intrinsic motivation is something you're doing for yourself. It's might be hard to explain why it's such a motivation. It's just something that gives you joy. And if I can give an example to illustrate what the difference between the two, let's take that classic trope of a cliche of wealth, the yacht, right? Let's say somebody is trying to save up money to buy a yacht.
Yeah.
The question needs to be asked, what is the yacht for? What is the purpose of this money? What is the purpose of the yacht? Now, if the answer to that is, well, the purpose of the yacht is so that I can take it down to wherever expensive marina is in your locality, which might be Salcombe for me down the south coast. That's where all the other wealthy people go. I want to sit on the back on a Friday at 6 o'clock with my champagne so everyone can see me, right? Research tells us that that is an extrinsic motivation. You're trying to impress other people.
Yeah.
Whereas if you say, well, I want to take it down, in my case, to Cheddar Reservoir, because I've always sailed, it's always been my hobby, it's a passion of mine. That's where my social life is. And when my adult kids come home from university, they love to come there and I spend some time on the boat. That's a very intrinsic motivation for wanting the yacht. Now, if your joy comes from extrinsic, from other people, you can never achieve it. Because every time you get it, you need to go and get it again and again and again. Yeah. So if your happiness is living on the other side of somebody else's approval, you can never catch up with it.
Yeah.
Whereas if your well-being is coming from internal, intrinsic sources, I'll give you another example. I love my cricket, as I've probably guessed from the mentions. I play cricket at my local club, my village club, and we might have won the league. Do you know what? I probably can't even remember. I was never that motivated by that kind of thing. But lots of my teammates were win again, win again. Well, every time you win again, great. That feels great. The next week, you've got to do it again and again and again. And then you win the league. And then what happens? You've got to win the next league. You can never catch up with it.
Yeah.
Whereas when my kids got to the age of kind of 8, 9, 10, we had no youth set up because everybody was so focused on winning the league. Or
Yeah.
they didn't think about community and the kids. So I started a youth cricket setup with my kids and some of their friends, and it started to grow. And some of the parents then got involved, and some other kids. Now in our little village in Somerset, we have 180 kids every Friday night coming down to play
Wow.
cricket.
Wow. That's
Now,
tremendous.
none of those kids and their parents know that I started that.
Hmm.
I sometimes, not often, but I sometimes will go down and have a beer with a couple of the coaches I used to work with, and I'll just look out and see 180 kids, and I have a huge sense of internal pride and
Yeah.
satisfaction. It gives me joy knowing that that's something that I did. So, extrinsic motivations, wealth, status, impressing other people, is an endless game.
Yeah.
Whereas chasing intrinsic meaning and purpose is something that will give you much longer lasting joy.
It's and purpose. That word that you used there is, I personally believe, is vital for us. But it's interesting the look on people's faces when you talk about purpose in connection with finances. Why are we covering purpose? What's purpose got to do with that? But you've just described it so well in
The
terms of that.
purpose is what gives you joy.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
a short
exactly.
answer, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, and it gives you meaning, to life in a sense. It's the as the Japanese call it, the ikigai.
Ikigai, yeah.
But
Going back to this this chap who sold his business,
yeah,
comment that he made was that he was currently looking which car to buy. Now, I have no interest in cars whatsoever. I'm not a petrol head. And he, nor was he particularly, but I just asked him, so what sort of cars are you looking for? And they were all really, really expensive cars.
mm,
And so I just asked him, are you interested in cars? No, not particularly. So these seem to be expensive cars. And he said, well, I've got to have something to show for my money, haven't I? And I said, show who?
yeah,
And he
yeah,
just went, oh, yeah. Do you really care what people outside in the street are thinking as you drive by in your expensive car? By the way, they're very likely thinking tosser.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I worked in the world of the investment management world for a number of years, and it was interesting just observing the different attitudes to wealth and finances per se by some of my colleagues. Some of them were, at the beginning of their career, really, and it was interesting. It was very, very difficult to really relate to them because for them it was all about the pursuit of wealth and to be seen to be successful. So things like the car would have been, a symbol of success.
Yeah.
Whereas the older generation, I'd go out to lunch with them and they'd be talking about their hobbies, comics they collected. And it was nothing, and it didn't matter who you were, what I suppose your standing in society was. It was just, we all had something that we were particularly interested in. I had to sort of, it perhaps showed on my face one day when one chap says, "Oh, I collect Barbie dolls."
Lovely.
Given that he's very topical at the moment, but
Yeah. That's great. And look, I think there's an important thing to just get out here, which is I certainly am not going to be judgmental.
yeah,
If somebody wants to buy an expensive car, great.
yeah,
It might be that they really love cars and they love, and I don't know anything about this, but a more expensive the car might be nicer to drive.
yeah.
That's fine. I'm not going to judge anybody who says that they want to be a millionaire. I
Mm,
will just ask them what being a millionaire will give them, however,
yeah,
because I know what the research tells us. This isn't my opinion, Phil. This isn't Chris
yeah.
Budd's opinion
No,
on life. This is what the research from academia, there's loads of academic studies I could share with you.
yeah,
There's psychology, there's neuroscience, and there's religion. Buddhism has been talking about this stuff for 2,500 years. There's nothing new here. It's just we've forgotten it.
yeah, yeah. I agree with you, Chris, and likewise, I'm aware of so much research out there on this subject, and it's one of the reasons. It's like my sort of motivation to want to join people like yourself and sort of talk about this in a way that people start to listen and start to acknowledge, actually, it's not just about how healthy my money is. It's about how healthy am I? What do I know about myself that might influence how healthy my money becomes? And so it's one of those where you realize you're swimming against the tide in some respects. But I look back in history, and had it not been for people who often swam against the tide, we probably wouldn't be the nation or the people that we are today without those pioneers, in a sense.
Yeah,
So yeah,
it's not always easy, though, I can tell you.
it isn't. There's moments of kind of despair when, I had a situation where I was talking to one organization, and they were telling me how they'd done a survey to establish what people needed within the organization around the area of well-being. And they said, nobody mentioned anything about finances. They just happened to be on the call with a colleague who suddenly piped up, whether this colleague just wasn't kind of in the ballpark at the point, but just suddenly says, well, we never asked them about finances. I thought, oops.
Yeah, and look, there's your point about how people look at you askance when you talk about purpose and stuff. The swimming against the tide phrase you use has resonated with me, because there are so many vested interests in this narrative not getting out. I don't want to get all conspiracy theorist about this, but it's a simple fact that marketing and advertising wants us to buy stuff.
Yeah.
The more stuff we buy, the better they do. But buying stuff doesn't make you happy.
Yeah.
If you go, I'll give you a little example of this, actually. So this is a thing I call being a financial well-being junkie, right? We're all financial well-being junkies, because what happens is we have our level of well-being. It's called set point theory. We have a set level of well-being that we all have, and we oscillate around that set level of well-being. So we will all know somebody who you would say is just happy being miserable, right? We all know somebody like that. And then there's people who just seem to light up the room when they walk into it. They're always joyful. Well, that's our set point, and we each have our own set point. Yeah. And we oscillate around that set point. So something will make you happy, and that's nice. So you don't want to change that, but you'll get used to that. And so you move back down to your set point. Or something might make you sad. That's not so nice, but we then get used to it and we move back up to our set. So we oscillate around our set point. Yeah. As I say, when we get happy, that's great. We don't want to change it. But when we're sad, we might want to do something to stop feeling a bit sad. So what do? We buy stuff.
Yes.
Even a name for it, retail therapy. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Which was a phrase first coined not by psychology, but by marketing, by advertising. So that's what advertising is doing. It's trying to push us down below our set level of well-being so that we will buy the thing that they say will make us happy again. And I'll just give a little illustration of how this works in practice, this financial well-being junkie concept. Once again, a cricket reference, actually. So Gloucestershire Cricket Club is my team. Last summer I went off to watch a 50 over game on a Sunday, and as I got there, it started to drizzle. A drizzle is the worst thing for cricket because it might stop, it might not, Yeah. So I wait an hour, and after an hour, it hadn't stopped, and the game's not looking like it's going to happen. So I give up, and on my way home, I stop off at a record shop and I buy 50 quid worth of records. And I'm sitting in the car driving home, and I look down these records. Oh my God, I've just done the very thing that I tell people. I was feeling all fed up, so I went and spent some money.
Yeah.
And it's so easy to do. And there's so many people who are encouraging us to do it.
Yeah.
But it's not actually a very good source of well-being.
Yeah.
So in the workplace, and a lot of the HR people that you'll be talking to, they don't recognize this as being a problem because we don't know it's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if we help people with their budgeting and help them to manage their money, we're only doing half the problem. It's like putting a plaster on a cut and then carrying on getting the cut.
Yeah.
And putting another plaster on. So if we understand the forces that are preventing us, that are getting us to spend more than maybe we can, and there's other ways of getting that hit of happiness, then we can have a much longer term solution to the problem.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I echo what you say about I suppose the approach to getting us to spend more and the circumstances that we find ourselves in. I had a client who a property lawyer who, among friends, earned a lot more than their friends, but often would find themselves in debt, and they didn't understand why. And it's an interesting journey that we went on to explore what was going on. And one of those aspects was, if there was a stressful day in the office, they would go and do some retail therapy. And I actually said to them, I said, so, just tell me about this retail therapy. What do you do? Where do you go? And so on. And for them, it was like clothes. I like something, I'll just buy it. I said, well, next time you see something and you like it, why don't you just say, okay, I won't buy it now. I'll go away and think about it. Well, I couldn't possibly do that. I said, well, why not? Well, it might not be there when I come back. So I said to them, so what difference will that make to your life? And you get that person who has that light bulb moment. Well, it won't actually. And the next time I spoke with them, they said, Phil, you'll never guess. I actually saw something I really liked and I walked past it. And I said, great. Well, at least that's a start in the right direction.
And listen, if next Saturday, a week later, you walk past it again and it's there, you think, I really want that, then get it.
Yeah,
But that, just separating that impulse from the moment, that's the important thing. Again, this is not a mantra about you're not allowed to spend money, you're not allowed to enjoy yourself.
Exactly.
It's not about that. It's about good financial decisions.
Yeah.
And it's about understanding the sources of joy and the sources of well-being and aligning your financial world with that.
Yes.
And spending more money you don't have on things you don't need to impress people you don't like, to quote somebody I can't remember, is not a good way to live your life.
Yeah. I'd heard the statement that financial decision making was around about 80% emotion, 20% education. Obviously, we're not literal, and it will vary from one person to another. But at the end of the day, emotions play a huge part in this whole process. And you actually touch on the emotions. In fact, you talk about things like worry. And so you said here, Ajon had some research, and they said 55% of average earners and more than 1 in 3 of society's top earners worry about money. I've often said to people that, according to research, 94% of the working population worry about money in one shape or another. I wanted to touch on that a little bit, because also you take us through the area of the impact that stress has on us in a physical sense, as well as the emotional, and how the two are intertwined. Go on.
Well, that was my starting point, actually. I just, on that subject of more, I just want to, one of my favorite quotes is George Michael, who said that being rich doesn't make you any more happy, it just gives you different problems.
Yes.
I think that's brilliant. I love George Michael. I think that was absolutely fantastic. But the effect on the body. So this is what I learned. This is my starting point. My wife is an oncology nurse, and she was doing some work at the Penny Brohn Cancer Centre. And they have a bit of video, which I sometimes use when I do talks, conferences or what have you, of what's called an immune cell. So we all have these immune cells in our body. They're like the little police of the cell world. They go around kind of just stopping bad things from happening. And this video shows an immune cell going up to a cancerous cell and literally consuming it and eradicating it. And this is what's going on all the time in our bodies, right? These immune cells are going up and getting rid of the bad cells, such as cancerous cells. But sometimes, obviously, what happens is the cancerous cells get together, they win the battle, and that's where tumor forms and cancer happens. Now, conventional medicine will then zap the cancerous cells. That's what radiotherapy and chemotherapy is. But there's another part to the argument, which is we should give more support to our immune cells. Stronger, to help the body to heal itself. Not say this is instead of conventional medicine, but we can be doing this at the same time, and we can be doing it beforehand. It's actually called lifestyle prescribing. Is one of the names given to this new branch of medicine. So my wife's telling me all about this stuff, And I said, well, I can understand the things we can do to help cancer. Sorry, help cancer, help the immune cells.
Yeah.
What's bad for the immune cells? She says, well, stress, and getting a cancer diagnosis is very, very stressful. So that in itself. So I said,
Yeah.
well, also worries about money is very stressful.
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely, she said. So that kind of worry and stress, especially for somebody with a cancerous diagnosis, but for all of us, money is very stressful.
Mm.
So this had this light bulb moment. Well, I need to write a book called How Financial Planning Can Help Prevent Cancer. And she looked at me and went, I don't think that's a very good title.
Yeah.
So that's when I came up with the title Financial Wellbeing. But that is the connection with the body, is that if we can get a better relationship with money, not constantly trying to get extrinsic motivations, constantly trying to get more, but instead understand our relationship with money and how it can create better well-being and reduce the stress, that actually supports our immune cells and is better for our bodies as well. So it is actually healthier as well as happier.
Yeah. As a side to that, because you later on you talk about motivation and the three aspects of motivation, and one of those being relatedness. And I think of relation. Not, I know what you're saying regarding that, and we'll come to that in a moment. But in terms of not just the health of the body, but health in relationships.
Yep.
Because I think work I did in money and debt advice world, there was something like 1 in 4 relationships were breaking down because of money conflict. And oftentimes the money conflict came around because they didn't understand themselves and they didn't understand each other and how they perspective that they had on money. So I said to somebody, even today, I said, it's like two people stood at a junction, they see an accident, but they're on the opposite side. They've seen the same accident, but they've seen it from different perspectives.
Yeah.
And yet they can't see that another person has an opposite perspective to them. And so it contributes to the conflict. So
there's a great advert for the Guardian newspaper back in the 80s and 90s. I don't know if you remember it, but it was talking about different perspectives. And there was a man, businessman, bowler hat, probably reading the Times, standing
right.
On the pavement, and in the background you can see a skinhead turn around and stare at him. Real tough nut skinhead. And then it pans to the other side of the road, kind of halfway through the road, and you see the skinhead starting to run towards this guy with his face snarled up, and you're already judging what this situation and scene is that you're seeing. And then
Yes.
the third perspective was right from the other side of the road, where you could see a piano was falling out of a window and about to land on the businessman, and the skinhead was there pushing him out of the way.
Right.
And it
Yes.
was a brilliant example of what you described, of different perspectives on the same situation. And
yes.
If we see money, if we have this view of money as being the objective of life, so many do. We've got to accumulate more money in order that we can get financial security. But you haven't got the other perspective of what will financial security give you? What is the purpose of this exercise? Suddenly you realize that money is not the objective. It's the engine of our well-being.
Yes.
So only by zooming out and getting the full picture, which is what I hope we're trying to do, Phil, you and me, only then can you really get a better relationship with money.
Yeah. Going back to what I said earlier about what you said in your book about the area of motivation, you mentioned 2 things. Motivation is made up of 3 things: competence, relatedness, and autonomy.
Yeah.
And competence, I suppose, my first thought when I was reading that was the education. But it goes back to what you said about the fact that you can educate somebody as though you're actually just putting a sticking plaster on it, but you're not really addressing the real issue.
And I think I have a bit in my bonnet about this one, Phil. You're pushing my buttons on this one, because financial education, I think, starts at the wrong place. There's a famous phrase. If you go to, I think it's an Irish phrase. If you go stop in rural Ireland and say to somebody, "Excuse me, could you tell me the directions to so and so?" and they'll say, "I wouldn't start from here."
Yeah. No, yes.
But for me, that's how financial education is, because they will educate you on compound interest and what a mortgage is and how pensions work and what an ISA is, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And then they might add a little bit of happiness theory on top if I manage to persuade them. But that's the wrong way round. That is accumulating your money and then saying, what should we do with it?
Yeah, yeah,
Instead,
sure.
we should be understanding the principles of well-being and what motivates us and what brings us happiness first.
Yeah,
And then we need to start learning some of the principles of money. So financial education for me starts in the wrong place. And in the workplace, most of the stuff that I see is around helping people to manage debt or helping people to budget better,
yeah,
which is important, don't get me wrong.
yeah,
But it's
yeah,
only a small part of our relationship with money.
yeah,
So we should be helping people to understand all of this stuff that we're talking about, that I write about first, I think, but even if it's not first, together with at least, please, the financial resilience stuff of managing debt and budgeting better.
yeah, sure. Yeah, because well, I mean, the whole thing to do with education. I worked with an organisation called the Personal Financial Education Group, PFEG for short. We like acronyms, and it doesn't exist now because its purpose was to lobby government to get them to change their approach to the national curriculum and include financial education in the curriculum. And there was a perception of a win back in around 2013.
Right.
And so therefore the organization became obsolete. But it's interesting, even just with education, when I talk to students leaving higher education, what financial education have you had whilst you're going through the educational system? And they look at you blank.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so officials say to me, "Oh yes, it's there. It's in here. It's in that. It's in maths. It's in some obscure subjects." And I'm saying, yeah, but if you're talking about education, it's a life skill.
Yeah.
But I agree with you. I think it's a small part of what makes the whole, and the whole is understanding self. And so
Yeah.
when you yeah
Even financial degrees,
yeah
even actual financial services qualifications miss the blooming point as far as I'm concerned. There's a lad locally who's doing a financial advice degree.
yeah
And I saw him, and I said, "How's it going?" "Oh, I'm loving it. Yeah, really enjoying it." "So, you any thoughts about what you're going to do with it?" "Yeah, I want to get into investment management."
yeah
Oh, that's the most boring part of the whole thing. But it's sexy and it's money and it's millions
yeah
and it's Wolf of Wall Street and all that rubbish. It's not the point. It's the
yeah
most boring part of the lot, as far as I'm concerned. Um,
yeah
but will you have been taught anything about our relationship with money and self-limiting beliefs or behavioral
yeah
finance or any of this stuff? Absolutely not. They don't do it
yeah yeah
yet,
But
Phil.
yet, yeah, but
Yet.
that's our goal, isn't it? Is to get people to recognise how important that aspect of humanity is, and how influential it is in every aspect of life, not just our money, but
Yeah.
it is so important on our money side.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I just touch on one little point there, the
yeah,
behavioral
sure.
economic stuff, because I just chucked out those phrases. We might be thinking, what are those things? Well, behavioral finance is such a fascinating area, and it's one of my four cornerstones, the title of the book.
Yeah,
And it's all about how we have biases built into us
mm,
that create behaviors,
yeah,
which are in there for good reason. So let's take loss aversion, right? Loss
yeah,
aversion is where we feel the loss of something 3 to 4 times more than we feel the equivalent gain.
yeah,
So if
yeah,
you lose something, like there's a friend of mine called Neil Page who's great on this stuff. I use his example, but I always try and reference people that I use their stuff.
yeah,
So Neil, I will give this example that if you imagine losing your purse or your wallet, something with your money and your cards in, oh God, so annoying, because I've got to go and I've got to cancel everything. Then wait another week, and then a day later you find it again, and you go, oh, that's good. We
yeah,
don't feel as strongly about finding it as when you lost it, because
yeah,
we feel the loss of something much more than we feel the equivalent gain. So if the stock market goes down, oh, stock market's gone down, billions wiped off the value of shares. The stock market goes up, oh, that's nice. You know, so
Yeah.
loss aversion is something that is a behavioral bias that we all have. It's there for a good reason, because if you're a caveman and you're about to be eaten by a woolly mammoth and you've lost your spear, you're going to be pretty hacked off, right? So, well, you're going to be probably eaten alive. So
Yeah.
it's there in our systems because it's there to protect us. The
Mm.
trouble is, not all of these behaviors are in our best interest these days.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I talk a lot in the book about the different behaviors that may be creating bad financial outcomes.
Yeah.
Now, just one little word, just coming back to why we start in the wrong place with this. A lot of behavioral finance theory, when used in finance,
Mm.
is used to help you beat the investment markets.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
I can't help but think you're missing the point.
Mm.
It's the line I use in the book is that for me is a little bit like buying a piano and then chopping it up for firewood. Behavioral finance is there to help us make better financial decisions, and better means financial decisions that will make us happier,
Mm.
not
Yeah.
just to get a bit more from the investment market and performance. That's really
Yeah.
missing the point for me.
Yeah. It's interesting, having worked in the investment world, the whole herding bias
Yeah.
was very noticeable, especially when the market became quite volatile. You're suddenly watching the behavior of the investment managers, and they're going, "Oh, what are you doing? You're selling? Oh, right, yeah, perhaps I ought to sell." And you're thinking, "Yeah, but hang on a minute. When the market's buoyant and everybody's, at one with the world, you're sat there and you're pulling all the evidence together, and you're creating these wonderful reports for your clients. What's happened." And you can see that behavior and the external influences that influence those biases. The whole thing to do with the motivation side, I think, has a spill out into other areas, and it was interesting. I think you talk about autonomy. So we know about the education side, the relatedness. I'll just mention that relatedness also means having a sense of being part of something beyond ourselves, which I thought was great, to have meaning and purpose. And it's often not just in money, but in other aspects of life. There is an innate wanting to be something, part of something bigger than yourself.
Yeah.
A sense of belonging. But obviously here in
those intrinsic motivations again that I was talking about earlier on.
Yes. And likewise with autonomy, it's interesting. Some of the people I've talked to, they don't like to be told what to do. They like to be the ones in control. And so to help the motivation, I said, well, having a plan in place certainly puts you more in the driving seat. At least it informs you to make, better informed choices. But you said autonomy includes living a life that is compatible with what you believe. It's when you're thinking about autonomy, and when you made that statement, which I thought was a very interesting statement, what was it that was really sort of resonating with you that drew you to that statement?
Well, let me try and think of an example. I know loads of people, I'm sure you do as well, who work for companies that they don't like what the company does.
Yeah.
So you might have somebody who believes that we should do something about climate change working for an oil company, for example, because we need to make a living. And I'm not judging those people. We've all got to make a living, but there will be an element of their persona, I would suggest, of their well-being, which will struggle and which will be making them unhappy with that, because they know that they're not being consistent with their own values and beliefs.
Yes.
And it's easy for me to sit here and pontificate about that. It's not so easy for people to, So I was just going to give an example, which might have been a little bit inappropriate. So
You
I
can't
stopped.
suck it back, Chris.
Yeah, I did well there. I'm glad you told me that you don't edit, otherwise I would have been in trouble. But so yeah, it's about understanding yourself. The process I called in the first book, Know Thyself. Understand
Yeah,
what it is that will make you happy. What are your own values? We talk in the second book. There's lots of exercises at the end, and one of them is an exercise to help you work out what your own values are. And then
yeah,
just say to yourself, is what I'm doing with my life consistent with my values? Because
yeah,
that is a source of well-being and happiness.
yeah.
And living in your life where you're not being consistent with your values, whatever's forcing that situation might be out of your control, might not be out of your control. That is something that will increase your well-being if you can get a better alignment.
Chris, this is brilliant, and as I said even before we started recording, this is to read your book as it is now. I'm just, it's like I'm punching the air. I'm thinking, fantastic, and to know that there is been the beginning, certainly growing sense of we need to do something different about our finances, because we're not really scratching where it itches in a sense. And
Yeah.
so
And actually, there's also another issue there for which we touched on earlier, but I just want to bring out again, which is
yeah,
very often we don't even realize that there's a problem.
no,
We're just blindly walking through this stuff, like my client, my coaching client, who didn't even know that was a problem until he's achieved financial security, and then went, "Oh my God, I've been doing it all along, doing it wrong all along."
yeah,
So that's why we've got to wake people up a little bit,
yes, yeah,
wake them up to, hang on, you're actually being pushed down a path here that is not necessarily good for you.
yeah,
And we're not saying it's wrong, but just saying it'd be worth just having a look around and just seeing if there are alternatives.
yeah, definitely. Well, Chris, I would really like to sort of promote your book, because I believe it's of real value. If anybody's going to invest in anything, invest in your book.
Bless you.
I would say to our listeners, it's called The Four Cornerstones of Financial Wellbeing: Creating a Pathway to a More Healthy and Meaningful Life, by Chris Budd. And Chris, it's been an absolute honor and privilege talking to you, and I mean that sincerely as well.
That's very kind of you, Phil. Thank you very much for asking me to come and chat.
And I appreciate you giving this time. So, Chris, if anybody wanted to sort of make contact with you in any way, shape, or form, what would be the best way they could do that?
Probably social media. So I'm on LinkedIn, also on Twitter at Ovation Chris. Ovation was the name of my company. I haven't got around to changing that yet. So that's probably the easiest way.
Yeah, right, brilliant.
And can I just say, if there's any financial planners or financial advisors listening to that, the best way is to come and join the Institute of Financial Wellbeing.
Yes, yeah, my apologies, that's remiss of me.
That's all right.
That's really important. And the fact, when you originally set it up, it wasn't the Institute, but it is now
Correct.
The Institute of Financial Wellbeing.
Yeah.
And
again, something that gives me great joy, and for the rest of my life, I founded an institute. I think that's quite cool.
Yeah, yeah. It's not one of those status things, is it, Chris?
I honestly don't tell anybody ever. I keep it to myself.
No.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Chris, have a great rest of the day, and thank you so much for being with me today.
Thanks, Phil.
Okay.